Now I'm writing a history of the Second World War that includes make a first step towards developing a genuinely Asian understanding of the Second World War. There's a real Eurocentrism to Western, and I mean English language writing, mostly from the US and the UK, where it's very victor-centric, victory-centered, claiming a moral superiority because of what their great-grandfathers did. That is being used politically by everybody. All national leaders will use the Second World War to make their countries feel good about themselves. I think to create that kind of Asian perspective, which is this move from a war that begins as a war for empire, metaphoricizing into an Asian war against all empire, Japan or European, in favor of an Asia made up of nation states. So I think that's how the war itself transforms. The Second World War was in Asia, and how that created sort of the Asia we now know, the Asia of Asia, sovereign Asian nation states. The origins are there, and this is hugely important. When I first started doing this, and I talked with my supervisors and other people that no, it needs to be done, it's a good idea. But others, the most common comment was, Hans, you're a nice guy. You shouldn't be writing about military history. I said, well, actually, no, this is too important to do. And so I am going to do this. That's why I really put a lot of energy into researching the Second World War. Fortunately, there's a lot of primary sources in the Second Historical Archives in Nanjing and in Taiwan. And so we could write real history using archival sources to do this. The Second World War in China by a previous generation of Western historians was seen as sort of completely insignificant. All those arguments that say that, American European arguments, that China has done nothing to defeat the Japanese. Well, actually it's done a lot. Of course, it's trapped Japan, and it's made the choice very clear. While, of course, in fact, for a long time, the Americans had done nothing to fight the Japanese until 1941. The Second World War in China really about defending a Chinese nation, a Chinese country, a Chinese civilization. And this was a fight to the death, and everybody knew it. And people were, of course, horrified by all that was going on, but this was something that had to be done. It should, I think, by placing this in a global framework of resistance against colonialism, imperialism, of creating a new world order, but also of a shared humanity, where we all have gone. The victor countries are the great exception, and the rest, Europe and Asia, actually share far more than, and I think that needs to be recognized. There's always this idea that Europe is responsible for 2 world wars, and it should not be. Actually, Europe is responsible certainly for the First World War, but the Second World War begins in Asia. Japan was copying the European model of empire, believed it needed sources, resources, manpower, oil and things like that, tin, quinine, rubber, all those things. I think the context here is very important. When Japan moved into North China, into Beijing, Tianjin and so on, the question becomes completely different. There is no compromise here. Either we stand up to aggression, and we stand up for China, or we fail. The tragedy of the Second World War is a global tragedy in which, in fact, many areas experienced similar traumas. And so I think the kind of fate that my grandfather had would have been very similar to those of many people in China. And I think the difference here is between countries that were occupied such as my home country, the Netherlands or France or Belgium, but also China. And I think that common experience of being occupied is actually very important in understanding a Chinese perspective or a Dutch perspective on the Second World War. It's very different from experience or the perspective of countries that were not occupied, like the United Kingdom or the United States. It's always struck me that secondary literature or the histories of the Second World War out of the UK, out of the United States, really don't see what that was like to be occupied. And there's another way in which that experience came true to me, that there's sort of a joint history there. It's not as separate as people make it. When I was a child and my mother would give me food, if I would not completely eat everything on the plate, she would get so mad, so angry, because she had suffered real famine in the 44-45 hunger winter when 20,000 Dutch people died. So the United States and the UK were the only countries that didn't suffer serious food problems in the Second World War. The rest of the world did. It's a huge difference. And I think it ripples through the generations. So that's why I wanted to tell that story about my grandfather, that my interest in the Second World War is partly a personal interest. It has affected me profoundly and has driven me to write about this. I think any great disaster like the Second World War, it will take 3 generations at least, maybe 4. You know, it takes 3 generations for human beings to digest this and for then something to become not personal history, but part of a public history that can be thought about creatively and independently away from. And that, I think, you know, that's to overcome those kinds of evil, catastrophic periods. And needs to be given time and openness and understanding. In Europe now, many people, large parts of the population, are ready to forget. That's a good thing. So I have been very caught up in wartime memories, the fate of my grandfather, family members of Phil's. I remember growing up, you still had air raid sirens practice until I was 10 or 12 or something like that. And that, you know, leads children to think what this is for, what will happen, what do I do if there is another war? Will I kill people? These are awful questions and left me traumatized. I couldn't sleep. And then I was talking to other people in the Netherlands and in China. I think they've had the same kind of fears. We live in a very uncertain times now. But at least I hope we can see this as a reminder that people should really be careful. It's one reason I write. Again, I'm an historian. You know, war is a regular thing. It's not going to be abolished anytime. It's not going to happen. But please, I mean, we know with Ukraine, with Gaza, these things can spin out of control very quickly. In some ways, I want people to forget about this, move on. This is not our war. It really isn't. But don't forget how horrible an unconstrained total war can be. And if you want that, well, then really do think about what this did to Europe and Asia. For me, I began as an undergraduate in the Netherlands. I went to China, to Beijing, for the first time in 1986. I was nervous because this was a year before I finished my PhD. If I don't like the country, what am I going to do? But, you know, we took this train ride from Hong Kong to Beijing. I talked with a lot of people. That was very interesting. Beijing in the 1980s, 1986, was a really interesting place to be. There was a lot of intellectual dynamism, a lot of energy. I met a lot of graduate students in various departments. They were very helpful to me. And it was full of sort of these incongruent notions. So as the train pulled into Beijing, I saw, it was early morning, I saw some hippie-looking young man having a guitar playing Bob Dylan songs. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool. I liked it. And I was 26, 27 at the time. And I've never been tempted to do really anything else. Go on this ride with China. And what a privilege it has been. But to see a country go from serious poverty to see this country take off in the last 4 decades. And that's just an enormous and a big geopolitical changes taking place, should take place. Asia, in China, India, Indonesia, these are huge numbers of people, these economies are thriving. Of course, things are going to change. China is embracing this new role as a major power in all our lives. I think that is a huge change. You know, for a little Dutch boy who had no idea that any of this was happening, to have that opportunity to be part of this story, to witness it in some way, has been, you know, an enormous privilege, and lucky me, really.